Okay, so we're going to pick up here with part 3, and we're going to be looking at our seventh cranial nerve, also known as our facial nerve. So, if you use our mnemonic that we've been using, so some say money matters, but my brother, so B both, we're going to have both sensory and motor functions belonging and associated with our seventh cranial nerve. So, we get a couple of different areas of sensory and motor innervation thanks to our seventh cranial nerve. So it's arising from our brainstem. If you ever do a sheep brain dissection, odds are your seventh cranial nerve is not going to be visible. Usually, it's just the first six that we've already talked about, but it's going to arise from our brainstem. What it's going to do is for sensory, it's going to innervate the anterior 2/3 of our tongue for our special sense of taste. So our ability to taste things that are on the anterior 2/3 of our tongue is going to be due to our facial nerve, specifically a small branch known as the chorda tympani nerve. Now, this chorda tympani nerve, it's a unique nerve in that it runs through our middle ear cavity first. So it's a branch off the facial nerve, runs through the middle ear cavity, and then it's going to join a branch of our third mandibular, the third division of our trigeminal nerve, which is the mandibular division, V3. It's going to join the lingual nerve and then innervate our tongue for our special sense of taste. But what it does first, like I said, it runs through the middle ear. When it runs through the middle ear, it is right next to our eardrum, and it could potentially, it really doesn't, but you could think of it in theory, it could be stimulated by auditory stimuli, and it could move along with the middle ear ossicles, the bones, whenever we are in the process of hearing sound. So, what that means for us is that theoretically, if the chorda tympani nerve were to be stimulated in the middle ear cavity by sound, what you could theoretically have is would be able to taste different sounds. Okay, so I'll say that again. If it is, and this is all in theory, it doesn't really happen, but in theory it could. If in the middle ear, you have your chorda tympani nerve, and it is stimulated, it's moved whenever the middle ear ossicles vibrate and move. If that happened to take place, you could theoretically taste sounds. Different sounds would have different tastes. There are instances in which people can have this kind of mixture of different senses, so sound and taste and vision and all these different things, our sense of touch, they can be associated with each other. So this is called a synesthesia. So some people can hear shapes. Certain shapes make a sound, or we are able to taste sound in this instance. So a synesthesia is just when you have two senses kind of become intermixed and associated with each other. Our facial nerve is also going to have a motor function, and it's innervating all of our muscles of facial expression. So if you remember, our trigeminal nerve, our fifth one, was innervating all of our muscles of mastication. This one is getting all of our muscles of facial expression. So our muscles that make us smile and grimace and frown and all these different faces we know how to make. There are 6 main branches off of the facial nerve. There's the temporal, zygomatic, buccal, mandibular, cervical, and then the posterior auricular branch. And each of these are named just in the general area where the branch is running. So the temporal branch is running along the temporal region of the skull, zygomatic along the zygomatic region, zygomatic arch, the buccal along the cheek, mandibular around the mandible, cervical down into the neck, and then the posterior auricular right around the backside of your ear. The cranial nerve 7 facial nerve is also involved with our autonomic nervous system, and it carries preganglionic parasympathetic fibers to our salivary gland and our lacrimal gland, so either to stimulate the production of tears or to stimulate the production of saliva via our salivary glands. So here you can see facial nerve. It's right next to our vestibulocochlear nerve. It's very close to it, and rising off the brainstem here. Here you can see that little chorda tympani nerve that is branching off, joins our lingual nerve, And again, it would be running in our middle ear cavity, and we're innervating all of our muscles of facial expression, which is being represented by this image on the right. This is showing the chorda tympani nerve running through our middle ear. So you can see it running right through here, right next to the tympanic membrane, next to these different muscles here, joins our lingual nerve, and then continues after it has joined the lingual nerve down to our tongue to get that anterior 2/3 of our tongue for our special sense of taste. So the next one we'll talk about is our vestibulocochlear nerve, or our cranial nerve 8. Now, this one we'll talk about more when we get to our senses lecture in the next lecture video. But this is going to be purely sensory nerve, and it is for our special sense of hearing as well as equilibrium, so being able to maintain our balance. Both the 7th cranial nerve as well as the 8th cranial nerve, so facial and vestibulocochlear, run through the internal acoustic or internal auditory meatus, and then differ in their pathways from there. Sometimes, as a note, sometimes you'll see cranial nerve 8 referred to as the acoustic nerve. This, I personally don't like this term quite as much, just because it leaves off one half of what the nerve's function is. So the term vestibulocochlear encompasses both functions, vestibulo referring to equilibrium, and cochlear referring to the actual hearing part of the nerve. Acoustic is referring more to just the hearing aspect of the nerve, and doesn't really take into consideration the fact that this nerve is involved with our sense of balance and equilibrium. So that's just a little note. Here you can see vestibulocochlear nerve branching off right next to where we had our facial nerve. So here you can see the external ear, the pinna. You can see the external acoustic meatus, sometimes referred to as the ear canal. You have your tympanic membrane, your middle ear with your auditory ossicles. That chorda tympani nerve would be running in here. And then you have your inner ear with your cochlea, as well as your semicircular canals, and your this is more of your vestibular apparatus here, your vestibular system, and then this here is your cochlear system with the special sense of hearing. You can see your pharyngotympanic tube, also known as your auditory tube or your eustachian tube, which is connecting the nasopharynx up to the middle ear cavity. And we will talk more about this when we get to it in the senses lecture, but essentially what you have is sound waves from our environment being funneled in by the auricle or the pinna into our external acoustic meatus. Those sound waves vibrate the tympanic membrane or our eardrum. It will stimulate the movement of the malleus, and then the incus, and then the stapes. That will push on this oval window here. That will then cause fluid-filled chambers to move in this cochlea, and it will stimulate the cochlear aspect of our vestibulocochlear nerve, and we'll get our ability to hear that. In our primary auditory cortex, if you recall from our brain lecture of the central nervous system, is located in the temporal lobe of the brain. So again, we'll go over this in more detail, our process of hearing, when we get to the special sense of hearing in the senses lecture. Our 9th cranial nerve is our glossopharyngeal or glossopharyngeal nerve. It has both sensory and motor functions. It's going to get our posterior 1/3 of the tongue. So if you remember, a facial nerve was anterior 2/3. Our glossopharyngeal is the posterior 1/3 for taste. It also sends fibers to something known as the carotid body and the carotid sinus. These are chemoreceptors and baroreceptors respectively. So these chemoreceptors, this carotid body, is going to monitor the contents of the blood and determine if it is becoming too acidic or too basic. And then the carotid sinus is measuring the distension of this area. It's at the base of the kind of internal carotid artery. It is measuring the distension of the vessel in response to an increase or a decrease in blood pressure. So it's having to do with our cardiovascular system here. We have the motor function to to one muscle in particular known as the stylopharyngeus, which is connecting from our styloid process to our pharynx. You don't really have to know that, but do know that the glossopharyngeal nerve has a motor function as well. And our 9th cranial nerve is sending preganglionic parasympathetic fibers to our parotid gland, which is a large gland along the, it kind of sits atop and superficial to the ramus of the mandible, if you recall where that is from your study of the skeleton. So here you can see glossopharyngeal nerve, cranial nerve 9, and we will. I thought I had a picture of the parotid gland here, but I guess I don't. You can look up a picture of where the parotid gland is, overlying the kind of the ramus of the mandible. It's a relatively large gland. All right, our 10th cranial nerve is going to be our vagus nerve. Our vagus nerve is sometimes referred to as the wandering nerve because it really wanders kind of all throughout the body. It starts up at the base of the brain, in the brainstem. It travels through the skull. It travels down into the neck region. It continues into the thoracic cavity as well as all the way down into our abdominal cavity. It contains, it's a sensory and motor nerve. It gets the part of our tympanic membrane, part of our external ear is innervated by the vagus nerve, as well as taste to our epiglottis. So we actually have taste buds and taste receptors on the epiglottis. If you recall, that's the flap of cartilage that when you swallow closes the opening to the larynx to prevent food from going down into your lungs, essentially. And then its motor function, it has lots of your laryngeal muscles, so in your larynx associated with your ability to speak is your vagus nerve. There's a branch called the recurrent laryngeal nerve that comes down and then it swoops back up to go back up into the cervical region and get your laryngeal muscles. Some of your pharyngeal muscles, so around your pharynx, as well as palatal muscles associated with your palate. It also gets one muscle associated with your tongue, and we'll look at that in a little bit. And then, like I said, it's going to get your thoracic and abdominal organs, some of the parasympathetic innervation to those regions. So when you watch the autonomic nervous system lecture, there's going to be parasympathetic and sympathetic. The vagus nerve is going to contain preganglionic parasympathetic fibers to the thoracic and abdominal organs. So parasympathetic referring to the rest and digest component of the autonomic nervous system. So when it innervates things like the heart, it may drop the heart rate, it may slow it down, it may also drop blood pressure and things like that. And again, referred to as the wandering nerve. So here's our vagus nerve, cranial nerve 10. This is showing it as it kind of exists in the body. So it starts way up here at the base of the brain, gets part of our ear and our pharynx, our different muscles up here. We get innervation to our larynx and our laryngeal muscles here. So you can see this little fiber coming back up. It gets our part of our heart, to control our heart rate and the speed at which it contracts. And then it gets abdominal viscera way down here, particularly foregut and midgut structures. So our 11th cranial nerve, we're almost done. 11th is the spinal accessory. Sometimes you'll see it referred to as just the accessory nerve. It is purely motor, and it gets two muscles. It gets the sternocleidomastoid, and it gets the trapezius muscle. So sternocleidomastoid is the one you can feel if you look to either the left or the right. If you feel on the contralateral side, meaning if you look to the left, if you feel on your right, you can feel this large kind of cord-like muscle in your neck. That's your sternocleidomastoid. And same thing, if you look to the right, feel on your left, you will feel it. Oftentimes you can see this muscle on people pretty easily. You can also see the tendons of it. It's going to attach down on your sternum, part of your clavicle, hence sternocleido, and then it's going to attach, it's going to insert along the mastoid process of the temporal bone, and when you look to one side, it is going to be pulling, that contralateral one is going to be pulling on that mastoid process to cause you to look that opposite way. Our trapezius is going to be a muscle on it's really kind of on our back and along our neck, but it's really an upper limb muscle. It's going to be involved with moving the upper limb, but it's located on the back. It's going to attach to parts of the scapula, and the trapezius can do lots of different functions depending on which fibers of the trapezius are actually firing at any given time. So you have superior fibers, you have medial fibers, and you have inferior fibers. And depending on which ones are contracting, the scapula can move in different ways. So here's our 11th cranial nerve here. It actually contains a part coming from the brain, and then it actually has a part coming up through the foramen magnum to join it. And here we can see our sternocleidomastoid. We can see our trapezius back here along the back of the head, neck, and part of the back, attaching to our scapula. And then we see our cranial nerve 11 spinal accessory on the deep surface of both of these muscles here. So our last cranial nerve that we'll take a look at is our hypoglossal nerve. If you know the term glossal or glossus refers to tongue. So this is going to get 3 out of our 4 extrinsic tongue muscles. So extrinsic meaning it's not part of the tongue itself, but they attach to the tongue. Intrinsic tongue muscles are those that actually make up the tongue itself. So this hypoglossal nerve will get 3 of them, and we'll get styloglossus, hyoglossus, and genioglossus, and then there's one more which is palatoglossus, which will be innervated by our glossopharyngeal nerve. So we can see this here, our hypoglossal nerve, and here we have these tongue muscles. So we have styloglossus, hyoglossus, and then genioglossus, and there's one not here, which is the palatoglossus, which we said is innervated by a separate cranial nerve, which is not our hypoglossal nerve. All right. So hypoglossal meaning underneath the tongue, so it originates here from underneath the tongue and kind of comes up in here and provides innervation to all these. And then you have your intrinsic tongue muscles, which are actually part of the tongue itself, and it gets all of those different fibers within the tongue. So we will stop there, and we'll pick up with part four discussing our spinal nerves.